Education is essential to life. It occupies the center and crossroad of the present civilized world. Just the same way some pioneer institutes are blazing the trail for assertive intellectual growth and tremendous developments to our society. This is the celebration of the Institute of African Studies, University of Ibadan. The University of Ibadan, also fondly called the Nigerian Premier University, was founded in 1948, shortly before our West African brother, Ghana, also established the University of Ghana, Legon. Suffice to say that these two universities were the products of a prolonged debate, struggle, and series of consultation following the demand by the nationalist leaders for African universities from the then British colonial governments. Academic works commenced immediately in the University of Ibadan, UI, with studies in the faculties of arts, science, and medicine. The school later expanded tremendously, and today it has produced so many scholars who are in different parts of the world, occupying the commanding heights of commerce, industry, as well as in international development corporations. Despite what you would call a perfect start, the spirit of excellence and the knack for quality education once again made our leaders to discover the need for a creation of further arms of study. Considering the fact that the models of education used in those days were foreign and it did not have much bearing with African thoughts and philosophies.
They believed that the idea of university education, which as you know in West Africa became reinforced in 1948 by the establishment of Ibadan and Legon, the University of Ghana, was pretty foreign. And they believed that theories of knowledge, epistemologies, theories of teaching, and so on, and theories of acquiring first-hand knowledge is largely European, since of course we inherited European traditions of university education. So they then believed that it was necessary for us to domesticate that knowledge so that it will be relevant for Africa. It is a good idea if you have a professor of physics from Cambridge or from Oxford teaching physics to Nigerian students, but they believed that it is okay. These are universal forms of knowledge, but sometimes you have to establish it and contextualize it in the context of the mother continent, and that is the only time when it can make a lot of sense to Africans.
George Washington during his lifetime declared that knowledge is in every country the surest basis for public happiness. Also, the former American president Abraham Lincoln was once quoted saying, "The philosophy of the classroom today will become the philosophy of government tomorrow." In other words, for a pattern of education in a country or continent to translate into public happiness, development and progress, assertive intellectual capacities must be generated by the best way suitable to bring development to that continent. And so, precisely in 1962, African leaders under the auspices of International Congress of Africanists had a conference in the University of Ghana, Legon. This conference had in attendance the first president of Ghana and the foremost Pan-Africanist, late Kwame Nkrumah, many leaders of thoughts and pioneer academicians from Nigeria, including the first indigenous vice-chancellor of the premier university, UI, Professor Kenneth Nwuka Dike, as well as other leading lights in the education sector. As a people always setting the pace for progress in Africa, the Nigerian delegates came back from the Legend Conference and established the Institute of African Studies, University of Ibadan.
It is a revolutionary move to say, look, this is our continent. We need to put our own framework in place for discussing our problems. Our Yoruba people will say, over
100 of them in 1962, and had this big conference where they discussed the idea of African studies in African universities. And thereafter, Kenneth Nwuka Dike came back home. He was not only the director of this institute, he was also the vice chancellor of the University of Ibadan. He came home and established this institute, and since then we've had about 12. We've had about 10 or so directors.
Another interesting part of this story is that the creation of the institute happened the same year that the University of Ibadan also became a full-fledged and autonomous university that's no longer affiliated to the University of London. And so, this development ushered in an era where university education began to give respect to some elements of African thoughts and nativity.
African study is a conglomeration of all academic disciplines. Even if you study medicine, there's an African perspective to it. There are archaeologists, who are focusing on Africa. There are, even engineers, people in politics. So every discipline is represented in African studies. And that is why we mention all the various disciplines that we have as core courses. So, as a postgraduate institution, the African Studies in Ibadan, accommodates anybody from any discipline at all, as long as the focus of your research is related to the subject matters that we are also focusing on. So you can apply any of your backgrounds to any of the subjects that we do.
Music is also run at the undergraduate level. Law is run at the undergraduate level. You know what I mean? So, history, it's run at the undergraduate level. But the tradition in Ibadan here is that when you build or when you set up institutes don't run undergraduate programs. So you can study any degree from any department at the undergraduate level, but when you're coming here, it's purely a postgraduate program. You're only coming to do a master degree or a PhD, That's the idea of institutes in the University of Ibadan.
The Institute of African Studies, UI, from the start, assumed the position of a leading institute within the African continent. Numerous research works that are yearly conducted bear witness to this claim. These research findings were later compiled into the archives of sound and pictures in the Institute. Also, The institute began in 1963 to publish its scientific researches and findings in the bulletin named the African Notes. The African Note was what later transformed to the International Journal of African Studies, which has continued till date.
We are research fellows in the house, primarily set out to carry out studies and conduct research, document, do compilation and publication of knowledge generation, distribution, and promotion, basically. But then the other aspect has to do with, training the next, the manpower for the next generation, which is also the second arm of the responsibility that is placed at on the shoulder of the institute.
Sometimes in 1977, the Senate of the University of Ibadan, the supreme policy-making body, turned the Institute of African Studies from a purely research institute into an institute of multidisciplinary postgraduate teaching programs. With this development, the Institute of African Studies became the largest and the flagship institute of postgraduate study in Nigeria. Today, there are up to 10 departments of study and a postgraduate student population that is perhaps the largest in Africa.
The number of academic programs we have in the African Studies program, no other African Studies program on the continent has our number of programs.
Every year we produce up to 10-15 PhDs and sometimes up to 50 or 60 master degree programs, master degree graduates under the auspices of the various programs. So it's a large institute by any standard, and we thrive on the fact that we also, as much as is possible, we try to become innovative. It's a multidisciplinary center, and we invite our colleagues from science, from medicine, from law, from agriculture to come and work with us. And I think that if you look at the corpus of the journals that we have produced up to date, we have reflections of various disciplines, especially from agriculture, from medicine, from science. There was a time we brought together scientists working on electricity and rainmakers and indigenous people creating and stopping lightning and rain. And we brought them together in a very robust exchange, hoping that it will be possible to merge the idea of tradition and modernity.
Part of the major achievements worthy of note in the Institute of African Studies UI, it's its research in respect to development of Arab metropolitan cities. The institute carried out diverse studies to investigate what changes had visited the cities as they transit from small typical African villages and small towns to big, bubbling urban centers. Another huge contribution of the Institute of African Studies UI to the body of knowledge in Nigeria, or perhaps the entire world, it's its efforts towards improving and modernizing the African healing system. Today, just as it's done in some developed Asian countries, many people are beginning to realize the efficacy of herbal medicine and are hopeful that with further works, both the orthodox and herbal medicine will begin to complement each other, and the African society will consequently achieve its long-awaited medical breakthrough.
WHO statistical data shows clearly that 70%, over 70% of Africans patronize traditional medical practitioners. So only 30% patronize Western medical. So then the question therefore remains, which is the authentic? And in fact, many people that go to traditional medicine, to Western medicine for treatment. When they are not able to have relief, they come to traditional medicine. People who have cancer, diabetes, people come here with all kinds of problems, complicated cancerous issues of diabetes, ulcer, I don't know, what we call it, paralysis, all kinds of complicated, seemingly, incurable illnesses. And they come here for all these things. And many of them, or most of them, people have attempted to visit doctors here and there without result. And so, if we say no to this traditional medicine, we are not saying no to our existence. And if we say yes to it, we are saying yes to our progress. Because this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Herbal medicine is the gold mine for Africa. Africa has the largest number of plants all over the world. Over 560,000 types of plants are here. And every plant has one healing purpose or the other.
The Institute of African Studies, UI, further added some feather to its cap by establishing the Peace and Conflict Studies Department. With this giant step, the university has received many accolades and special recognition from various international bodies for its creativity. It happened just the time our world needed to understand the concept of conflict and its resolution, following series of crises in the world and an apparent decay in diplomatic relations between various countries.
Presently, in African Studies, we are having courses in the area of African history, anthropology, African visual art, musicology, and we have African law, we have ethnomedicine, religion and belief system, in addition to peace and conflict studies, which we, in a way, we adapted to be relevant to African studies. That is, we consider peace and conflict study from African perspective.
I think one of the things that this African study should be looking at now is how democracy is the issue all over the world. The rule of law, human rights and all that. How can we use African studies to deepen the democratic process in Africa?
One can go on and on and on, highlighting many achievements of the Institute of African Studies, University of Ibadan. But the story will not be complete if a mention is not made of the coming First African Congress of African Studies.
Knowledge production now is more of the Western. So we have African Studies Association, African Studies Association of US, of UK. But we want to come down here to promote knowledge within the African context on Africans.
Before this time, there used to be the American Association of African Studies. This United States-based body organizes its annual conference, which draws attendance of scholars of African studies all over the world. The possibility and results achieved by this association no doubt became an impetus for the establishment of the African Association of the African Studies. After several meetings and consultations, it is just normal that other African countries concede the hosting rights to the University of Ibadan to stage the first international conference of the African Association of African Studies in Africa.
Different nations of the world are competing to understand Africa. If you go to Europe, you have several African studies programs. If you go to America, you have several African studies programs. Now, the biggest African studies programs are in America, they are in Europe, they are in different parts of the world. And what these African studies programs do now is, in fact, to dictate the pace of development in Africa. If we want to gather information now on the future of African economy. We have to travel from here to America to go and attend ASAA conference. That is African Studies Association, whether of Europe or America or wherever. So you go there, you pick information from for developing your own continent. And I think that is what some of our senior colleagues are trying to stop. Last year, a number of leading African scholars met. They met in Accra, Ghana. And the team from Nigeria here was led by our director, Professor Delilai Wola. They met in Accra, Ghana, and they came up with this interesting idea of having our own African Studies Association that is based in Africa.
Looking at the theme of the conference, African Studies in the 21st century, past, present and future. So we're going to be going back, delving back into our rich cultural heritage in Africa, in Nigeria, in this western part of Africa, or in western part of Nigeria, and not only limited to Nigeria, but other parts of Africa. There'll be keynote conference speakers. I'll be talking about the African tradition and culture, and not only the Nigerian culture, the African tradition and culture in general.
It is our hope that this conference will be most rewarding, that the gains will translate to greater heights for various institutes of African studies in attendance.
To all our participants at this conference, we look forward in seeing you. We are working very hard to make sure your stay in Nigeria is a very comfortable one. And I'm sure that at the end of the conference, you would no doubt want to visit the Institute of African Studies, Nigeria and West Africa over and over again.
Congratulations to the Institute of African Studies. Congratulations to the University of Ibadan. Congratulations to several institutes of African Studies outside Nigeria. But remember, the reward for hard work is more work. Continue to work hard so as to take Africa to the peak of its potential. The eye of the entire world is on our continent.